Humans have been preserving food for millennia. Many ancient civilizations dried, froze, fermented, cured, and pickled foods. There is even evidence of jams and jellies in ancient civilizations. And although these practices were and continue to be a sustainable food source, historians also believe these food preservation practices held cultural significance. We know they still hold cultural value and sustenance value today. Canning is the newest method for food preservation beginning in the 1790s, but Nicolas Appert did not fully understand his new and successful food preservation method. At the time, the exclusion of air was credited for the preservation of food. But two notable things happened not long after. In 1851, Raymond Chevalier Appert patented the pressure retort, basically a type of pressure canner. This canner allowed temperatures to reach 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and then our good friend Louis Pasteur in 1864 helped our knowledge in this area when he discovered the relationship between microorganisms and food spoilage and foodborne illness. It wasn't until the 1920s, however, that the significance of the pressure canning method and its relationship to Clostridium botulinum was actually understood. The timing that pressure canning came onto the scene made it an ideal solution for food insecurities that arose during both world wars. It went hand in hand with victory gardens and was encouraged as a way to support communities during hardship, making it an important part of American culture. 1943 was the first peak in home canning in the U.S., with more than 4 billion cans and jars processed. There was another significant resurgence in the 1970s, and all along, the science documentation and body of knowledge related to canning was growing and being researched, including the serious health risks involved. In recent years, canning and home food preservation has seen a surge of interest, and many consumers need more information about safe practices when it comes to food preservation at home. So that's what today's episode is all about: understanding the health concerns with canning and how the experts work hard to keep you and your family safe. This is the Facts of Life, a Vodcast, where research from the field of family consumer sciences meets real-life applications. I'm Amanda Harner, a family consumer sciences agent with the University of Georgia Extension and your host. Our guests today are University of Georgia Food Safety Specialist and Director of the National Center for Home Food Preservation, Dr. Carla Schwan, and Dr. Kaitlyn Casulli, Assistant Professor and Extension Process Specialist in the Department of Food Science and Technology. And these are the facts on canning at home, safe practices for you and your family. When it comes to canning, it's important to understand that in terms of health, Clostridium botulinum or botulism is a major concern that drives the importance of safe practices. Botulism is found in many places in our environment. Some examples include soil, rivers, and seawater. Botulism bacteria produce spores. Under the right conditions, these spores grow and produce a toxin that is one of the most lethal substances known. When an individual is intoxicated with botulism, it is always serious and it can be fatal. Symptoms typically appear within 12 to 36 hours. Because botulism is a neurotoxin, it attacks the nervous system, and we see signs of descending paralysis that eventually causes respiratory failure. In other words, your lungs become paralyzed and you are unable to breathe. According to the World Health Organization, early symptoms include marked fatigue, weakness, and vertigo, usually followed by blurred vision, dry mouth, and difficulty swallowing and speaking. Vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, and abdominal swelling may also occur. The disease can progress to weakness in the neck and arms, after which the respiratory muscles and muscles of the lower body are affected. There is no fever and no loss of consciousness. With all this in mind, I asked Dr. Schwan to share some of her recent research related to botulism and home food preservation.
In the US, on average, we have about 50, 60 cases of botulism a year. And so when you look at the overall scenario of foodborne pathogens and foodborne disease in the US, you ask yourself, why are we talking about botulism when we have a million cases of other foodborne pathogens? To give you a comparison so you understand a little bit better why we are concerned with botulism cases and why it is so important, even though the number of cases is not as high as other pathogens in the US. The top four major pathogens that cause foodborne illness in the US. The first one is norovirus, is a virus. The second one is non-typhoid salmonella, Clostridium perfringens, and Campylobacter species. To be fair with the comparison, we are going to be comparing bacteria to bacteria. If we focus on salmonella, which is a bacteria, to compare with botulism, which is another bacteria, we see that salmonella, every year we have about 1 million cases per year. And so you're probably asking yourself, but why are we focusing, why are we're concerned with botulism cases when there's only 55 or 60, about 60 of those every year, when we have 1 million cases of salmonella every year? Let's take a little bit of a different angle on how we are looking at this. Instead of comparing cases of how many people get sick with the disease, we should be looking at how many people die from the disease. And to talk about that, we need to talk about case fatality ratio. Just to give you an idea, it's basically the number of cases of people that have died from the disease divided by the number of total cases that people got sick times 100, so we get a percentage, right? So when we do this little math comparing non-typhoid salmonella, we see that salmonella is about 0.5%. And so meaning that every 200 cases that people get sick with salmonella, one person dies. And when we look at Clostridium botulinum, so the bacteria that causes botulism, we know that every 100 people that get the disease, about 11 people die. And so it already gives you a very good indication that it's a very serious disease, a very serious foodborne illness, because a lot more people are dying from it. The second point that I want to make, and why we are concerned, why we need to care about this, is how much it costs for somebody to recover from this disease compared to the number one pathogen, the number one bacterial pathogen in the US, which is salmonella. So again, we are comparing here. So we know that for salmonella, about $4,000 per case. So every person that gets salmonellosis, it takes about $4,000 to recover. And then for Clostridium botulinum, it's about $1.6 million per person to recover. And so you see the difference between how much it costs for somebody to recover. It gives you an indication of how serious the disease is, because with botulism, usually people go under mechanical ventilation if they survive. And, thankfully, we have medical advances in technology that people are able to survive way more than they did in the past. And so to have that life support and physical therapy afterwards, given the paralysis of nerves and everything, it is very, very costly.
All right, so we've heard that though there aren't many cases in the US each year, botulism is very serious and very costly. But there are botulism cases that happen because of commercial canning, not just in home canning. So, do we see more cases commercially or in home canned foods?
Only talking about confirmed cases of botulism that were linked to home canned foods. A total of 40 events since 2015. There were 19 states in the US that reported that confirmed foodborne cases related to botulism. 111 people got sick from it, 108 were hospitalized, and 12 people died. And so, in general, 9 food categories were involved in those cases. But this is what we see since 2015, that the data that is available through the CDC website and their surveillance program. We see vegetables leading the number of causes of botulism cases, foodborne botulism cases in the US, from home canned goods, followed by seafood and soup. And so you can see that all of those food categories, they have something in common. They are all low acid food products. Now you're probably asking yourself, so how does it compare with the total number of foodborne botulism cases in the US? Not only people that are canning food at home, but also commercial or even other sources of foodborne botulism in the US. A total of 147 cases from 2015 to 2021. And those cases are a sum of home canned goods, commercial canned goods, and others. And so the others here is really to this prison where alcohol was produced illicitly. And so from those cases, if you break them down and if you see how much each case, each category here, the home, commercial, and other, is contributing to the amount of cases or people being sick from botulism, we can see that 75.5% of those foods, they were preserved at home. And so foodborne botulism in the US is mainly driven from home canning. In other settings is really the minority of the cases, but we really see home canning being the driver of the foodborne botulism cases in the US.
We now know that it is, in fact, home food canning that is the number one driver of foodborne botulism cases in the United States. So, let's dive into the science basics consumers need to understand about canning. There are 6 factors that affect microbial growth and survival in food: food source or nutrients for the organisms, acidity, temperature, time, oxygen, and moisture. 3 of these factors rise to the top as optimal conditions that botulism spores need to produce their toxin. The big one is a low oxygen environment, but room temperature and a low acidity environment also encourage their growth. Our goal then, when it comes to canning food at home, is to create hurdles that prevent the growth of botulism, but that still give us a quality product in terms of texture and flavor. We start by answering the question, what is the pH of the food I'm canning? Ultimately, that's going to tell us what canning method we're going to use.
Here we have a pH scale, and we basically divide this pH scale on from 0 to 14, where 0 is very acidic. So in this end here, around 7 is neutral, and then 14 is alkaline, so basic. And so for home food preservation, for canning specifically, we divide this scale into acid foods, so in this side of the scale, and low acid foods in this side of the scale. So what do I mean when I say acid and low acid foods? So acid foods, when we refer acid foods, it's the foods that have enough natural acid present in them. And so the acidity content of that food is towards this side of the scale. And then low acid foods means there is not enough natural acid present in those foods that are on this side of the scale. And then we have a third category that we often refer to acidified food products, that we have low acid foods, or sometimes a mix of acid and low acid food products, but there's not enough acid, so we add acid to that food product. So an example would be adding vinegar to make pickles, for example, or adding lemon juice or any type of acid that we add, sometimes citric acid as well, that we add to those products to acidify them. And so they would fall in this category too of acidified food products. And so for canning specifically, we have a cutoff of a pH of 4.6. And so this is the scale. And 4.6 is our cutoff that we say below 4.6. So if you go from here down below 4.6, you have acid foods and also acidified foods if you choose to add acid to them. And then above 4.6, we have low acid foods. And so anything that is greater than that, 4.6 is considered a low acid food product. And this is extremely important. This is one of the factors that we use when we test a recipe, when we validate a recipe, to determine which method we are going to use to process those food products. And some examples here, if you have, acid foods, I already mentioned pH below or equal 4.6. So here we have several examples. So most fruits are here in this category. So you see lemon, you see peach, you see strawberries, all those fruits are below 4.6, and then low acid food food products. Examples are most vegetables, fish, so seafood, meats are also here, and so bananas, corn, those are some examples of the pH or the amount of acidity that they have, and so they are considered low acid food products. So now that you know this division, now we can go back to which method should I use. And so this is a nice little summary for you to see. So again, if we have a pH that is below or equal 4.6, we are considering this acid foods. And if we have a pH greater than 4.6, we consider a low acid food.
There's one more thing we need to make sure we make really clear before moving on. It's some specifics on temperature and botulism. In the presence of a low oxygen and low acid environment, like inside of a can, we cannot afford to get the time and temperature wrong. Acidity creates an additional hurdle because anything below 4.6 on the pH scale is acidic enough that it won't support the growth of botulism spores. So, the more acidic a product is, the shorter the time for processing and the lower the temperature needed for processing. 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature at which water boils, is a sufficient temperature for an acidic product, assuming you follow the minimum time stated in a validated recipe. Anything above that 4.6 pH level, however, is considered a low acid food. Because of this, it needs a higher temperature and longer processing time to destroy the botulism toxin. Boiling water alone will not raise the temperature to the 240 degrees Fahrenheit needed to accomplish this. This is why we use pressure for low acid foods. It is the only way to drive the temperature high enough when the additional hurdle of acid is not present. If you're starting to think, hey, I got this, I get the whole pH thing. Just send me some pH strips. I understand the temperature thing. I can figure this out. Easy peasy. I can't wait to can my grandma's marinara recipe she brought back from Italy. It'll make a great Christmas gift. Maybe let's slow down and understand this is a more complex science than you might think. Even those who fully understand the complexities are likely not able to afford all the equipment that goes with it. So I asked Dr. Kaitlyn Casulli to help us. As consumers, when we can appreciate the complexities of the science with canning, it can motivate us to make better decisions to protect our health. Much of home canning documentation assumes that the consumer is not actually equipped for the science that's involved, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So, can you elaborate on this and explain what things are put into place to ensure that consumers have access to safe canning?
Mhm. Yeah, so I'll start out with, one of the things that we have for the science behind validating recipes is experts in thermal processing. So most of what has been done in terms of defining what a process authority is more industrially focused. And it focuses on canning at larger scales in larger size systems. But a lot of those same principles apply for home canning as well. So a process authority is someone who has expert knowledge, experience in the field, and then endorsement from their peers. And it could be someone who is, relatively fresh out of graduate school, like myself, or somebody who has been in the industry for 30 years. Maybe they didn't start as a process authority, but now they have the experience and the training. So now they could be considered a process authority. So as the process authority, we look at a bunch of things in the food, what we call critical factors. A couple of those critical factors are kind of our frontline defenses for food safety. So we have water activity and pH. So pH is related to the acidity of the food, and then water activity is related to the amount of water available to react. So if you have more water available, microorganisms are more likely to grow. Between those two factors, it's pretty complicated to measure. So if a consumer were advanced enough, we could offer that advice to say, hey, measure your pH. But a lot of the instrumentation is expensive. pH meters, a good one will run you probably about $100. So not too bad. But in terms of measuring pH, you have to think about a lot of things too. So pH is best measured in a liquid medium. So if you are doing a jam or a jelly, pretty easy to measure that. Whereas if you're doing a pickle, you have to actually not only measure the brine of the pickle, but take the pickle out, grind it up, and then measure the pH of that ground up material. So you can make sure that the acid is going all the way into the cucumber. Another interesting thing about pH is it's very temperature dependent. So I have seen people measuring hot liquid, which will have a lower pH, which is not really on the conservative side of safety. If we were really concerned about safety, we would want them to measure it at room temperature, where the pH is going to be the highest, because the higher pH is more permissible for pathogens to grow, especially if you're at 4.6 or above on the pH scale, which is where you see Clostridium botulinum coming into play. Water activity is not really a consumer thing, because the cheapest water activity meters that I'm aware of are about $10,000. So I don't imagine many consumers having an extra 10 grand to drop on a expensive equipment. Yeah. And it's another one that's a bit nuanced. It's temperature dependent. You have to handle the samples carefully to make sure you're measuring the right thing. So we really just ask consumers not to mess with those two things. In terms of the thermal processing, all right, now we have the pH and water activity favorable for any sort of pathogens to grow, like Clostridium botulinum. Thermal processing is our final line of defense before that food reaches the consumer. So we apply the thermal process. Canning thermal process is usually 240 for a consumer, up to 250, depending on what pressure you're operating at. So the lower temperature will correspond to a lower pressure, whereas the higher temperature corresponds to a higher pressure. And that heating process is pretty complex, because in the jar of food, you have different types of things in there. So, for example, if you're just making a jam or a jelly, probably one of the simpler ones in terms of thermal processing, or even a broth. So we're working right now to try and validate a seafood broth. That broth is going to be very low viscosity. So when you have a low viscosity material, as it's heating up, it's actually going to flow inside the container. So when you have flow, it actually heats up faster. If you think about putting your hand in an oven at 200 Fahrenheit, probably not going to get burned, because the air doesn't transfer heat very efficiently. But if you put your hand in a pot of water at 200 Fahrenheit, that's going to be trouble for you, because the heat transfers much quicker with the water. So it's all about how the heat gets transferred inside the vessel and then inside the container. There are other considerations that we warn people about. So using starches, so adding pasta or rice or mashed potatoes to recipes, that thickens it up. So instead of having that mixing going on in the container, when you get it thickened up, now the heat is moving from the outside to the inside. So a lot of people don't like thermally processed foods in cans, because it takes a long time to heat. So if you are thickening that product, it's going to take longer, because it has to move from the outside in, instead of stirring around and being more consistent and heating up quicker. There's also consideration of where the slowest heating spot is inside the container. So if you think about what you want to achieve is getting all of the material in the container to a constant temperature, and then holding that temperature for a specified period of time, you want to make sure that the coldest region is reached. So in the one where I was talking about the liquid mixing around, it's actually kind of at the bottom of the container, whereas if you're doing something where it's heating in from the outsides, it's going to be more in the geometric center. So if you're measuring from the sides in, it's about halfway, and then top to bottom, it's about halfway between. So you really just need the experience and the know-how to think through all these critical factors and, think about, is the material going to change while it's being heated? I was mentioning starches is one of those complex cases, not only because they thicken the material, but because they create what we call broken heating curves, where they heat up really quickly and then they thicken up and they slow down in their heating. So it's not as straightforward to be able to come up with the thermal process to process those types of things. So I think there's just a lot of misconceptions about, people see these things in cans on the shelf and they say, well, if industry can do it, why can't we do it at home? And it's really all these factors coming together and having the money and the expertise and the research equipment for us to be able to develop those recipes for consumers and make sure that they're going to be consistent enough that people won't end up under processing and getting either themselves or others sick.
So, I mean, because you're involved actually on both sides, right? Because you help with the validation of recipes for consumers to be able to do their own canning at home, and to do safe preservation practices. But you are also on the industry side of it, right? Because I mean, I know I've sent at least one person to you. You're looking at it from both perspectives when you're doing things in your job.
And that's really the approach I try and take to anything that I do in the lab or as an extension specialist is, take a look at this from multiple different lenses, take a look at it from the consumer side. I do home canning, so I can take that consumer look at it and say, well, if I didn't know what I know, what could I mess up from this recipe? Or what is actually really good about this recipe that we can carry through to others, because there's so much out there and everything is written in a different way. So you really just have to have not only the science, not only the consumer angle, but the technical writing aspect of how do you break down this recipe and the steps to make it nice and easy and really just not able to be broken by the consumer in a sense.
I really like that you brought out that point, partly because I mean, I think one of the things that we talk a lot about in training is when we get phone calls about why didn't this turn out in a way that I thought it was going to, even if it's, just from a perspective of the texture of it isn't that great or what have you. Listening for the consumer to say, well, I followed everything except I did this instead. And I think what has been fascinating to me about the process of food preservation and canning in particular is how much we think of baking as something that there's not a lot of flexibility to mess around with the recipe like there is with cooking. Even though they're all chemical processes that are taking place. But I feel that canning in particular is even more that way than baking is. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree. So if a cookie turns out bad, maybe it'll taste funny, maybe it'll be too crunchy or too soft, and you can still eat it. But if canning goes awry, you could potentially just be eating Clostridium botulinum toxin, and that would not be safe to do. We don't recommend doing that. So, if anything goes off in canning, or if you're making these changes without having the appropriate knowledge, that's when you can get into that territory of, implicating your safety or the safety of others if you're giving your canned food away.
So I guess that's a good place to ask the question. So why do we look at worst case scenario? And are we just concerned with health when we're looking at worst case scenario?
So I'll address worst case scenario at first. So the worst case scenario is usually what we will validate a recipe with. So I was talking about before the seafood broth recipe we're working on. And, it'd be really great if we could just make a seafood broth, put it in the jars, and then call it a day. But we really need to think about what factors will affect how that's going to heat up. Everything boils down to time and temperature. So it's not just hitting a certain temperature, it's actually maintaining that temperature for a certain amount of time and maintaining that temperature throughout the container and in all of the containers in your canner. So we would look at things like, what if a consumer were to do like a half-filled jar of the seafood broth? Would that heat up the same way as a full jar of seafood broth? We would also consider maybe adding a little bit of thickener to it to get that viscosity up so it's not heating as quickly as it would in a consumer kitchen. Sometimes some of these proteins will come out of the seafood and gelatinize a little bit, and that could thicken the seafood broth. So we really want to try and dig out what is the worst thing that could happen, validate that, so that way if a consumer does make a little bit of a mistake, little bit of error, they'll be okay with what they're doing. And I think this really kind of came to light for me with the 4% vinegar fiasco of 2023. Consumers were coming out and saying, I didn't even realize there was 4% vinegar, and here I was using this in my recipe. Well, if those recipes were validated at 4%, we could say, yes, that's okay. But if they're validated at 5%, we really can't make any kind of recommendation except, throw it away because we don't know if the acidity is proper in that recipe. And it would require time and testing on our end to say, all right, let's make every single recipe we have with this 4% vinegar and then test it to see if the consumer would be okay if they ate it. And we just don't have all that time and money, especially in a time of kind of, I guess I would say, crisis in home canning, because everybody was coming to us and wanting to know immediately what to do. So we had to do the best we could with the resources that we had.
I love that example, partly because I think it's actually a great example of why documentation is so important.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Because I just think, for all we know, it is possible that some of those recipes were actually tested with the 4% vinegar. Right. But because that was not documented and nobody found the documentation, we cannot then say to a consumer, yes, this is a safe recipe to use with this percentage of vinegar. Instead, we have to say, no, we have to err on the side of safety. Botulism is too serious of a disease, or sorry, not disease, but too serious of a health risk and pathogen to take a risk on. So we have to say no.
Yeah. Absolutely. I agree 100%. It's all about what the risk is and what it could do to the consumer. If it was maybe Salmonella or E. coli, I would still say throw it away, but it wouldn't be quite as dire of a public health hazard as Clostridium botulinum would.
Yeah.
We stress documentation not only on the end of the lab that's doing the testing, so that way we have all the parameters that we've used to validate a recipe and all of the data from validating that recipe, but also on the consumer side, because I know agents get questions and the consumer, you ask a question, you say, oh, well, what did you do differently? And they say, well, nothing. Okay, but something went wrong. You did something differently. And they're like, oh, yes, I completely forgot. I added more sugar or less sugar than the recipe called for. So writing that down and having that documentation is pretty important. And I would say everything really does boil down to time and temperature. So if you're able to understand and document those temperatures, if you're cooking your jelly in a pot, take temperatures periodically to see where you're going with that. So that way, if you do have issues with gelling, we're able to help you out with that.
I like that point too, because I think when it comes to the consumer, if the consumer is calling an extension agent or like calling into the Home Food Preservation Center, like that documentation can help us determine, this is a health risk issue at this point versus it's a quality issue. We're confident it's a quality issue based on what you're telling us.
Exactly.
And
Canning is too hard. Like, it's a lot of work, and we do not want people to have to throw away their food. But, in times of, have very high risk, Clostridium botulinum, I'm not going to mess around. I'm going to tell you to throw it away. But if you have those good notes and I can help step through the process with you, that'll get us that much closer to validating that science.
We've been using the term validated, and hopefully, you're beginning to understand it is important to only use validated recipes and methods in canning. We need to understand what validated means, and then let's hit on what the validated methods for canning are, what methods are not validated, and where you can find validated recipes and other research based information.
So when we say validated recipes, is the exact same thing as saying tested recipes. When we test practices, when we test recipes, we validate them with research and in the laboratory. And so we are able to determine different parameters, and based on those parameters, we can use tools to calculate a lethality, or how much bacteria will die based on the acidity of the product, based on how much time, based on the temperature of the product that is reached inside the jar. So there are several different characteristics or factors that we looked at to determine if a recipe or a process is validated or tested or not. So when we say use a validated recipe or use a test recipe, it means that that recipe had extensive research done behind that recipe. So the process that we came up with, or how much time and what method you're using to process that product, a lot of research was done in the lab, behind the scenes, using mathematical models, using specialized equipment, using expertise to really understand the complexities of that food product, and then to arrive to a conclusion, or how much time and temperature combination you need to ensure safety and quality of that product. When we talk about validated canning practices, we are referring to mainly 3 canning practices that we have research behind, that we know are safe, and we have processes for it. The first one is boiling water canning. The second one is steam atmosphere canning, and the third one is pressure canning. So those are the 3 methods that we currently use in the US.
Just a quick note here to tie a few things together. Earlier in this episode, we looked at how many people were getting botulism from home food canning. What we saw was home food canning made up about 75.5% of the reported botulism cases between 2015 and 2021. Now, this hints very strongly that consumers either aren't using validated canning methods, they are unaware of which methods to use in certain situations, or a combination of these things. So, Dr. Schwan also did a national consumer survey that looked at consumer knowledge about safe canning methods. What she found was that during 2023, though 62.3% of consumers used the 3 validated canning methods, there were still a whopping 37.8% using unsafe canning methods. When Dr. Schwan got even more specific, investigating what consumers knew regarding what canning methods to use for different food categories, the data revealed something even more concerning. When asked about low acid foods, so vegetables, meats, and poultry and seafood, about 85 to 90% of consumers selected a method other than a pressure canner, or the consumer reported not knowing what method to use. When asked about fruits, which fall under acidic foods, just over 55% selected an unvalidated method, or the consumer did not know which method to use. Okay, back to Dr. Schwan.
If we have a pH that is below or equal 4.6, we are considering this acid foods. And if we have a pH greater than 4.6, we consider a low acid food. And based on that, those are the methods that we're going to be using. So if you have an acid food product or an acidified food product, you can use boiling water process or atmospheric steam canning process. Of course, this process has some caveats and some key important information on the processing time that you use. So you need to pay attention especially to this. But in general, you can use boiling water process or atmospheric steam process for acid foods or acidified foods. And then for low acid foods, so foods that are pH greater than 4.6, we have pressure canning process. So there are also several methods out there that you might see in the internet that are not validated, that are not tested, that people still use, but we do not recommend those. And some examples are aspirin canning, the inversion method, oven dry canning, dishwasher canning, mirror canning. There's so many out there that are not validated, are not tested. There is no research behind them to ensure those methods are safe.
We've covered a lot of ground today, and the last thing we want to make sure you're left with is where to go for validated recipes and resources. First on our list is the USDA. The USDA provides consumers with the complete guide to canning. You can access this through the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture website or through the National Center for Home Food Preservation website. Second on our list is the treasure trove of canning information, the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which is housed at the University of Georgia. Here you can find a wealth of resources. You can either type National Center for Home Food Preservation into your web browser, or you can use our direct web address, nchfp.uga.edu. That's nchfp.uga.edu. Some of the notable things you'll find access to here are validated recipes, answers to common questions, the newsflash feed, which is the quickest and most convenient way to get the latest news and important updates on home food preservation directly to your inbox, access to the USDA's Complete Guide to Canning, and the So Easy to Preserve book available for purchase for $35, and tons of other valuable resources related to home food preservation. Third on our list are extensions and land-grant universities throughout the United States. You can find a full list of these universities at nifa.usda.gov. That's nifa.usda.gov. Then type land-grant colleges and universities into the search box on the upper right corner of the webpage, and you'll find that full list. Personally, I really like Penn State's Let's Preserve webpage. Here you can look for a particular food and see all of the safe ways to preserve it, from freezing to canning and every validated method in between.
The most critical things when it comes to canning is really understand what type of product you're trying to can. What are the resources that you have available, if you have the correct ingredients, if you have the correct equipment, and if you have the knowledge to start canning. And so if you don't, if you are a beginner and if you want to learn, it's a great idea to shadow somebody, maybe a friend, maybe call your local extension office and ask if they provide workshops where you can learn. Having somebody that knows what to do usually provides you with more confidence and can guide you through the process, so giving you that extra cushion and that extra help that sometimes by yourself that's a little bit harder. Please feel welcome to reach out to us and connect with your local extension office. We are here to help. We are here to provide information and research-based information and any guidance that might be helpful to you as well. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening in, and I hope to connect with you soon. Bye-bye.
The Facts of Life is a program by the University of Georgia Extension, an equal opportunity affirmative action veteran disability institution. Research-based resources referenced in and related to this episode of Facts of Life can be found in the episode notes and description information. The views and thoughts expressed in this video podcast are the speaker's own and do not necessarily represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the University of Georgia or the guest organizations and/or employers. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only. The University of Georgia name, as well as those of guest organizations and all forms and abbreviations, are the property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. These are the Facts of Life. Thanks for joining us. Check out our website at factsoflife.extension.uga.edu. That's FACS of life.extension.uga.edu.